Well, hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to be joined by J.D. Crouch, who doesn't need very much introduction, but suffice it to say, not only is he the new head of the USO, but I think he brings an incredibly interesting array of experiences here in Washington, whether it's at the Pentagon, at the White House, in his new role, and even in the private sector. Imagine that. I thought we'd really just jump right into the topic, because on the one hand, it seems almost crazy, right? We're doing a series about leadership in Washington, right? Like it sounds like a punchline of late night TV,
right?
I thought we should really start with that fault line that you've observed firsthand between political leadership, or lack thereof, how difficult it is to lead in our political climate today, and that military culture and how it works, which is to say almost the definition of organizing very large groups of people to take action together. So what, is there an inherent conflict between political and military leadership?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, Churchill said once at the summit, politics and strategy are one, which is to say that, whether you're a military leader or a political leader, you really have to focus on what are the important things that face either your country, your company, or whatever it is, and focus on those things in a laser-like way. Everyone is expecting you to do that. You have to be able to communicate to people, and that means not just talking to them, but getting their buy-in. And then you have to be able to build a trustful team of people that can help you make it happen. And so those elements, I think, are classic. They're true on the political side. They're true on the military side. In some respects, I think one of the differences is we actually train our military leadership to be leaders. And a lot of people in Washington come to Washington. They're smart people. They're bright. They're well educated, but they've really never had much of experience in being trained. What are the important elements of leadership? I think you do see that difference here in this town.
And let's talk a little bit about that. When you talk about training to be a leader, the Pentagon loves PowerPoint slides. Obviously, what goes on those when you then saw the political class in action? Those smart people at the National Security Council and the like. The world of PhDs and big brains. What were the ingredients that they hadn't been trained on?
Well, they may not have known how to manage people. They may not have known how to get the best out of individuals, right? They may not have even. I mean, one of the points we were talking about earlier is this notion of empathy. Leaders need to have empathy. They need to understand what their customers are thinking. They need to understand what their opponents are thinking. They need to understand what their employees. In the context of the USO, for example, we're an organization that has 400 employees and over 29,000 volunteers. So me having to understand what is it that makes those volunteers tick? Why do they come to do what they do? I think that question of empathy is something that's been lost in our political dialogue. We don't listen to what the other side is saying. We're already thinking about scoring our next set of points rather than really understanding and putting your shoes in the other person's socks, as it were, to sort of figure out maybe there's a way forward here.
Well, that's an interesting point, right, about point scoring. Some people would say, right, that one of the big differences between military leadership or political leadership or lack thereof right now, right, is that we're missing a shared sense of purpose, a goal. That it's easier to organize a large group of people to accomplish something when you have a very clear both chain of command and a sense of what you're trying to do. The mission has been framed for you, in effect. How much did you see that as being one of the things that hampered political leadership in Washington?
Well, obviously, political leaders have a broader palette in a way that they have to paint on, a broader canvas, I should say, that they have to paint on. and they have to take into account a lot of other factors. I mean, than a military leadership too. But don't kid yourself. You know, military leaders have to operate in a political environment as well. They have to know how to deal with political leaders. They have to know how to deal with people in the countries that they may be operating in, whether they be friendly or forces or non-friendly forces. So I actually think there's not that much of a difference between the two. Some of our most skillful military leaders have gone on to be political leaders in our country. And it's not an accident, as the Russians would say. It's not an accident, comrade. That,
they would say there's no accident.
Yeah, exactly. There's no accident. Exactly.
Okay, well, let's talk about some specifics. Let's talk about some things where you saw leadership in action or not. You know, probably one of the most interesting examples was late in George W. Bush's presidency, the decision to surge troops into Iraq, when many people, both inside his own administration and his own party, as well as outside of it, were questioning, shouldn't we just pull out from Iraq? This was seen as a very risky move at the time. You know, clearly there was some leadership involved. Tell us a little bit, first of all, what that was like from the inside. You know, how was there clarity gotten around we should make another pretty audacious decision at a time when things were going badly?
Right. Well, you know, President Bush came to the then National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, and me and said, look, we need to do, obviously, a review of Iraq. Things are not working. And he gave the following strategic guidance. I'm not going to quote it directly because I don't remember it directly, but something like, you know, if we can win, I want to win. If we can't win, we need to get out. And we need to find a way out. And so we did a comprehensive review. Both Steve and I went to Iraq and, of course, pulled all elements of the government together to try to look at this, and basically came to the conclusion that there was a way to turn this around, that there was but you're right, it flew against the conventional wisdom in Washington at the time. And one of the elements of leadership is being willing to have the courage of your convictions and being willing to act on that. And that's what I think the president did. Whether you agreed with Iraq or not, whether you agreed with the decision to do the surge or not, he had the courage of his convictions. He was willing to stand up and say, I'm going to take this and go all in. You know, an interesting element of that, very late in the decision process before it was announced, some people said, well, you may remember we put in about six new combat brigades, 6.5 new combat brigades. And somebody said, well, why don't we put one in and see how it goes, and then if you need more, we'll put another one in, and if you need more, we'll put another one in. And I remember him saying, I'm not going to make 6 decisions about this. We're either going to make the forces available to the military leaders and let them use them as they see fit, or not. And I think, again, that's another example of an element of leadership, which is you have to have trust in your team that they can execute once they understand what the strategy is and once you've communicated that.
Well, you know, I'm glad you raised that, because many people would say that example of a decision by President Bush stands in pretty stark contrast to some of the decision making early on, both not just the decision to go to war. You know, we were talking about my husband's book on the Bush presidency earlier, and one of the things that leaps out, right, in that account of what happened in 2003, right, is that there was no one moment. You could argue that there was a very murky kind of decision-making process around the actual invasion of Iraq. But I'm curious, because you did see the arc of this from different vantage points in the Bush administration. Was there something different that changed, just in terms of the leadership, in terms of the decision-making? You know, was there a better process? Was there just a different team?
Well, one of my professors used to talk about the interocular trauma test, which is when the facts hit you between the eyes.
Yeah, nothing like reality.
There's sort of nothing like reality to kind of focus. This was a policy that was going bad. and it needed to be turned around. It needed to be, fundamentally changed. And there was an alternative narrative out there, which was this, if you recall, the Baker Commission report, which basically was talking about, kind of a slow, steady pullout at that time. And clearly, that interocular trauma test forced people to be more clear about things. I give a lot of credit, quite frankly, to Steve Hadley for running a very positive process that was inclusive of people's views, but that got to framing up a distinct set of decisions. One of the things we love to do in Washington is muddle things together. Take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and muddle them together. And then you end up with something where everybody walks out of the room thinking, their particular position prevailed. And I think, quite frankly, you saw a little bit of that in the beginning of the Bush administration, where people walked out of the room thinking that their position had prevailed, and therefore there really wasn't a clear vision and a direction.
Right, and certainly historically there are a lot of examples of leaders who have encouraged that kind of creative ambiguity and tension among their advisors. Bill Clinton was famous for that at various times. Certainly there have been a lot of examples in American politics of it. It doesn't mesh very well at all with a war in specific.
It can be very dangerous in a wartime situation. Yeah. You need to be very clear.
So it seems like you did take away something very specific from watching that Iraq surge decision up close in terms of your own personal learnings about leadership, which has to do with isolating and what the decisions are and finding a way to make them.
Well, the first thing really starts with learning, getting an understanding of what's going on the ground. I'll give you an example. You remember back in, I think it was in late 2005, early 2006, the Marine who headed up the intelligence operation testified in front of John McCain's committee that Anbar province is lost, right? And it was headline news in the Washington Post. Well, I went out to Anbar province in October, and I met with some of the senior leaders who were operating out there, as well as some of the folks on the ground. And I said, we're being told back in Washington that Anbar's lost. And, the military guys, younger ones in particular, kind of shuffled their feet, and they threw a map out, and they said, sir, and now they were going to dumb it down and explain it to me. It's real simple, sir. There's a river that runs through this thing, and there's a road that runs down the river, and right now we can control about 2/3 of that with the force we have. And we are beginning to see the Sunnis in this area getting tired of al-Qaeda in Iraq, wanting to push them out. But they're not going to come over to our side if we don't demonstrate that we can protect them. Well, that was a nice moment, because I had a group of people on the ground who were living it every day, who knew what was going on. So I think, finding out what is going on, getting ground truth, and not just listening to experts back in Washington is a really important part of leadership. And that's, again, having that ear open.
So you can't be a leader if you're mouthing your own talking points to yourself. You gotta,
absolutely.
You gotta start with what the situation is, and then figure out what to do with it.
The other thing you have to do, though, is once you decide, you got to move forward. I like to think of myself as being an inclusive person when it comes to making decisions, but a decisive person once the decision is made. And a military leader will tell you, if you make a decision to do something, halfway through the execution of that is not the time to be questioning yourself, right?
And so tell me a little bit about that. Coming to the Pentagon, working there, what kind of leadership styles did you see there, and which did you see, along the spectrum from more to less successful? There's a sort of a caricature, right, of a military leadership style that wouldn't necessarily be called inclusive, right?
Right. I ran into all kinds of different personalities. I mean, it's hard to sort of isolate one. I think one of the things that Don Rumsfeld was good on was focusing on what's important, trying to figure out what is important and focusing on that. In his little book, Rumsfeld Rules, which I think he sort of collected over the years, he said, you manage through your outbox, not through your inbox, meaning, that place can bury you if you go to the Pentagon. I mean, the Secretary of Defense basically has enough work to fill up 24 hours a day just from what his staff is preparing. So somebody who really says, I'm going to figure out, what is important, and I'm going to stay on that message. I think it was a really interesting lesson that came from that.
Well, and but that does get at, I think, a really interesting question too, which is where does accountability factor in to leadership? Obviously, Secretary Rumsfeld in the end left the Pentagon. The president asked him to leave after the midterm elections in 2006. There was a sense that the Iraq War was not well managed in its early days, and how much of leadership is luck? How much of it is can you be a good leader and have a terrible result?
Yeah, well, anybody who serves at a senior level, whether it's the CEO of a company or an organization like the USO or in a senior government position, you're there really at the behest of the people that you're serving. I mean, and I think that's the ultimate accountability, and you have to expect that it isn't a question of whether it's fair or not fair. It's a question of what is right for the country, what is right for the organization, what is right for the people that you're serving. And if that means that you exit stage left, that's what it means. And if you don't walk in thinking that, I think you're fooling yourself, and I would question whether you can really be a good leader.
On this question of can you be a good leader, a great leader, and not achieve great results? How much do those two things go together?
Well, I mean, sometimes people have been faced with no-win scenarios, right? I mean, they have situations, and so in a way, you can ask yourself, how well did they manage that really bad situation that they were put into? But I find that usually great leaders will turn a positive result, right? They're not going to be remembered for failure.
Or maybe they're smart enough not to take on those challenges that are
Indeed.
hopeless. Right? I want to make sure that we get a chance to get some questions from the audience first, but give me a little bit of a sense quickly about your new challenge at the USO. You are very new to it.
Right.
And I've always found that when you come new to an organization, it's those first few months when you see them very clearly, right? Because you're coming as an outsider.
Right.
You have a very crisp sense of what strikes you as makes sense, what strikes you as doesn't. So what's your outsider's view of wow, here's 3 exciting things I can do with this place?
It's absolutely a national treasure. The USO was founded by Franklin Roosevelt in early 1941, well before we were in the war, understanding that the war was coming. Talk about a guy who had strategic vision, who really saw that we were going to need something to bring to help support our troops overseas. And it has really been a treasure at providing support, connecting people, and the like, and in ways that in some ways are hard to explain if you haven't been a customer. If you see a young 18-year-old show up in Kaiserslautern waiting to go off to fight in Afghanistan, he's never been out of Iowa before, he walks into the USO Center, there's somebody standing there who looks like mom, who hands him a ham sandwich and a cup of coffee and says, "Sit down, soldier. Relax, I'll make sure you get to your flight." The impact of that 1,000 times a day, in fact, 30,000 times a day. That's how often we see these people, 30,000 times a day.
30,000 times a day.
Yeah, is just unbelievable. And so it's a great thing. Now,
there's a big data opportunity. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that, but fascinating, right?
Yeah,
30,000 interactions.
Yeah. So having said all that, organizations have to change and stay relevant, and so where do we see some of the things? One of the things we've learned to be very agile and expeditionary. I like to say, we've got facilities in Kansas, and Kaiserslautern, and Kandahar, and we've learned how to be in all 3 of those places, and obviously they're very different. But at the same time, the military is now going to be deploying smaller deployments. We're starting now to support, for example, the operation in Western Africa by providing a satellite network that can connect the troops to their families back home. It's the one thing the commanders really felt strongly about. A lot of concern about, their potential exposure and those sorts of things. And so being able to connect with families back home is a really important thing, and that's something that the USO is really specialized in. But figuring out how to do that in an environment where we may be sending 500 troops or 1,000 troops, not the large numbers that you've seen in the past. And then finally, we're really focusing a lot on what's called transition right now. We're not a veterans organization. We support the active duty military and their families. That's our focus, and we'll keep that focus. But making sure that they can be successful veterans as they transition out is a really important part of what we do. And so we support programs and deliver programs across our 160 centers having to do with, hiring heroes and building stronger families. A lot of stress on the families as a result of these multiple deployments. In some cases, both mom and dad are deploying. So that's a very unique thing. And the stakes for this are huge because this is an all-volunteer force.
But it's very interesting as a leader, you're talking about basically a real-time reinvention of your model into multiple different models, that it's just.
Absolutely. What I'm calling it internally is reimagining our programs. And along the way, we also have to do something which is called refreshing our brand. Because most of the people in this room, I'm going to guess, think when they think about USO, they think of Bob Hope and they think of airport centers, right?
That's right.
And we do so much more than that, but we haven't penetrated the consciousness, I think, of Americans in terms of what we do. And that's one of the things that is a really important part of my mission. I want to make sure that people who are under 50, under 40, know what the USO does, know that it's a national treasure that really helps to
Luckily, the under 41s don't even know who Bob Hope is, so.
Well, that's right. But they know who Robin Williams is.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And Robin Williams was a huge supporter of the USO.
So let's grab a couple questions if we can. Here you go, sir. Hold on one sec. Can you do the microphone? Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Mark Johansson, I work with Boeing, and I enjoyed your little input on satellites as we're providing those services to the troops. But you had a great discussion on leadership in very tough situations and recognizing USO serves veterans. What about the tough situation at the VA? How does a leader get a hold of that and turn that around?
Great question. Thank you.
Well, as you know, my predecessor, Sloan Gibson, who was president and CEO of the USO, is now Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs. So he's going to have an opportunity to work that problem along with his boss. Again, I would go back to a little bit what I said earlier, which is, first of all, you have to have a period of sort of a new leader does, a period of a voyage of discovery where you're figuring out what is really wrong and needs fixing, as opposed to what the hype is in the newspapers and things like that. Once you've done that, then focusing on the 2 or 3 things that are critical to the success of the organization. Now, I don't know what those are for the VA. I know that Sloan is certainly focused on that, and I wish him the great success. But I think it's the same. It's the same thing. You can't do everything, and so particularly in a time period that's limited by the politics of our system. So for somebody like him and his boss to make those kinds of changes, they really have to figure out what's important.
Just a quick 2-finger intervention on that. There's been a long-running debate about, having this freestanding VA versus the Pentagon. Obviously, people inside the Pentagon have a lot of opinions about whether, this should be more connected to what they do. Did you ever have just a policy point of view on that? Whether we have the right setup to succeed? No. I don't have a view per se on it, but I think that in Washington, all too often, we're not open to looking at, more radical solutions to things. And whether it's a new organization or it's a different
or even a collapsing of an organization or putting things back together in a way that, the way that makes sense. Now, having said that, the Pentagon's got a lot on its plate right now. So to give it another mission on top of that, I think there's some logic in separating the two. I think they're very different activities. And you really want the military and the active duty military, I think, focused on, the threats to the country, however defined. And not necessarily focused there. But you need somebody, obviously, focused on the veterans' issues.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me switch tables for a second. Here you go, sir.
Thanks very much. Brian Bender with the Boston Globe.
Brian, can you get the microphone? Sorry.
Brian Bender with the Boston Globe. Good to see you. On your discussion of military leadership and the unique skills that young men and women gain in the military that's different from a lot of other sectors of society. When we talk about veterans, we hear a lot about veterans' employment, helping soldiers transition out of the military. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how, as a country, we can do a better job of tapping into that unique set of leadership skills when people are coming out of the military. I read the other day that Congress now will have the lowest number of veterans in generations.
Right.
I mean, if not ever. And I'm wondering if we've given enough thought to how do you tap into that?
Yeah, well, 1% to 2%, right, serve now. And that's why, the health of that all-volunteer army is important, all-volunteer military, is very important to all of us in this room. Because they're doing, in a sense, doing the job that, we expect of them, but they're also doing a job that we are not doing. It's not the same as it was in the post-World War II or even the Vietnam period. I do have some views on that subject. I think incredible leadership skills that have been built up by these young folks. We trust them, for example, with an enormous number of direct reports under very stressful circumstances. It's not unusual for a lieutenant or a captain to have, $500 million worth of equipment under their command. Can you imagine in your business giving somebody at that age access to and control over $500 or $1 billion worth of capital? Your board of directors would their hair would fall out, right? So they've really learned to do multiple things. We've got second lieutenants, captains, and majors who were fighting in the morning, having tea in the afternoon with Iraqis or Afghans, and building projects in villages in the evening, and having to do it. So they're pretty good multitaskers. So I think the problem is often on the soldier side is helping them understand how their skills translate into something that is useful in the private sector. And so I think we almost need a medium here. And somebody, people who can help them take that experiential leadership skill set that they developed and turn it into the kinds of language and understanding that a company will appeal to a company. And on the company side, and Bank of America is a good example, they're all in on trying to hire more of our veterans. But I think on the HR side, we need to invest in sort of people who know how to help those people be successful once they get the job. Getting the job is actually the easy part. It's staying in the job, being successful in the job, that is going to be the bigger challenge, I think. And a lot of these folks coming out, they don't just want a job. They want a career path, like we all do. And so I think those two things can really be helpful in creating a successful environment for that transition.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, so go ahead.
Ben Fernandez, U.S. Army. So you talked a little bit about the 2006 surge, and if you look at the press, there's been several discussions of civil military problems. Got it recently with Syria, with Afghanistan surge. We even saw it back in the Bush administration and the Iraq surge. There were certain military leaders that certainly did not agree with that. Question for you is, some of the problems, do you think that there is a problem with civil military relations? And if so, is it institutional or personal relationship? And what should or can be done to make it better or to sustain whatever good success there is?
Yeah. Well, you know, you only have to, you can go back to Thucydides and see problems of civil-military relations. So it's not exactly a new phenomenon, right? And in times of stress, those things tend to come out. You know, I think one of the things that is very helpful to our military is when you have sort of clear decisions about the direction that you're going to take. So one of the reasons why the surge, I think, was successful was even though there were different points of view on the military, and quite frankly, you want those points of views expressed. You don't want to suppress those points of view, and the process we ran allowed a lot of that stuff to come out and people to debate the various points in front of the president, so that the president had all the information he needed to make the decision, and he made a decision. But military, once a decision is made, is actually very good about, all right, we got it, now we know what we have to do. And I think where you see the worst aspects of civil-military relations is where decisions go unmade. And that's why that decisiveness is a really important part of leadership.
We have to get to our next panel, which I know people are excited to hear, General McChrystal. Let's just close on that note. I'll exercise my prerogative here for a final question while we finish up lunch over there. Today, we're looking at being right back in Iraq and in Syria in ways that clearly President Obama tried very hard to avoid having to make a military decision. You know, we've heard a lot of criticism, obviously, about how long it took to make the decision, what is the goal of this conflict. I'm just curious, you know, having seen the whole arc of our decision-making from 2003 on in Iraq, what are your thoughts as we return militarily to that country where we sacrificed so much? There was so much national anxiety around why we were there in the first place, and here we are all over again. I'm just curious what your views are of the war in Iraq that we're now back into.
Well, you know, the truth is we really have been in Iraq since the Gulf War.
That's right.
I mean, you know, a lot of people forgot that Bill Clinton waged an air war over Iraq throughout his entire presidency, and that it was President Clinton who signed the legislation which actually talked about the need for a regime change in Iraq. And I think one of the issues really surrounding that is the fact that Iraq's an important country. Iraq's an important country from a cultural standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and a political standpoint, in a part of the world that's very important to us. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see the decisions that have been made and the desire to sort of see whether or not we can't sustain our position there and sustain the position of our friends in the region. So it's not surprising to me that we just had an announcement, you know, I guess this week of another 1,500 soldiers going in a support role, but still, because the stakes are very high there. And 4 presidents learned in a way that you can't ignore Iraq.
I'm not sure if that's a sobering note to end on or not, but thank you so much,
Thank you.
JD. This has been a terrific conversation. I'm now going to welcome to the stage my friend and colleague, Jim Van Dyke, who's our leader at POLITICO, and General McChrystal. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.